The winter that year did not arrive loudly. It crept in like a judgment already made, settling over the valley with a cold so intimate it felt personal, as if the land itself had learned the names of those who would be left outside. Snow pressed against the town of red willow in slow, deliberate layers, softening rooftops while sharpening the silence. Lanterns flickered behind frosted windows, each glow a small declaration of belonging. I remember thinking, even then, that winter has a way of revealing who is willing to keep their light burning, and who is not. Eliza May Holloway reached the edge of town just as dusk folded itself into night. Her coat was too thin for the season, patched at the elbows with careful stitches that spoke of patience rather than poverty. Beside her walked Jonah, her son, his hand lost inside her glove, his breath puffing out in quick white clouds he pretended not to notice. They had been walking since morning, following the rutted road from nowhere in particular, carrying only what could be held without complaint. Eliza did not look up at the sky. She had learned that hope wasted itself quickest when aimed too high. The first door they knocked on belonged to the inn. Light spilled warmly through the glass, carrying the muffled sound of laughter and cutlery. Eliza smoothed Jonah's hair before raising her hand. The door opened only a fraction. Martha Kincaid's eyes traveled from Eliza's worn boots to Jonah's red nose, lingering just long enough to decide. There was no cruelty in her voice, only a practiced firmness. No rooms, no exceptions. The door closed with a gentleness that somehow stung more than a slam. They tried the general store next, then the parsonage. Each refusal grew shorter, less apologetic. Word moves quickly in small towns, especially when it has learned the shape of suspicion. Eliza felt it settling on her shoulders, the weight of unasked questions. A woman alone, a child with no father in sight. Stories people preferred to finish for themselves. Jonah stopped asking after the third door. He had begun to understand that answers could bruise. By the time the church bell marked the hour, the street had emptied. Snow whispered across the ground, erasing their footprints almost as soon as they were made. Eliza led Jonah toward the abandoned freight shed at the edge of town, its boards warped and split, its roof sagging like a tired back. It was not shelter so much as a pause in the wind, but pauses can mean survival when the night is long. As she worked to clear space, Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old shame that arrived whenever she failed to provide what Jonah deserved. She remembered another winter, years ago, when there had been a house and a fire and a man whose laughter filled the rooms. That memory had learned how to hurt quietly. She pressed it down, the way she pressed everything down, and focused on the present. Jonah sat on a crate, swinging his feet, pretending the cold was merely inconvenient. Above the town, on the rise where the land opened into wide pasture, Silas Crowell stood in the doorway of his ranch house. The building was solid, built from timber that had known better days and worse storms. Inside, a fire burned steadily, casting long shadows across walls that had learned how to keep secrets. Silas did not step out. He watched. From this distance, the town looked small, almost fragile, its lights blinking against the dark like uncertain stars. People spoke of Silas Crowell with a mixture of envy and accusation. Rich rancher, proud, unapproachable. They did not speak of the way he kept his land open for lost cattle, or how he paid his hands even when the season was lean. They did not speak of the woman he had buried on a hill overlooking the creek, or how the house had never quite learned to sound full again. Silence, after all, is easier to misunderstand than words. He noticed the woman and the child not because they were strangers, but because the child walked with the careful bravery of someone who had learned early not to complain. That kind of posture stays with a person. Silas felt something stir, unwelcome and familiar. He told himself it was none of his concern. The town had its ways. People had their reasons. Down by the shed, the wind shifted, finding every gap in the boards. Jonah's shoulders began to shake, though he insisted he was only tired. Eliza wrapped him tighter, murmuring stories she half remembered, her voice low and steady. Each word was a small promise she was not sure she could keep. Snow crept into the corners, softening the edges of the world until everything felt temporary. From the ridge, Silas turned back toward his door. His hand brushed the lantern hanging on its hook. For a moment, he saw himself as the town saw him, separate, untouched, safe behind his walls. He stepped inside, closing the door against the cold. The latch clicked into place, a sound final enough to echo. Yet the quiet did not settle. The fire crackled, the house breathed, but his thoughts had already wandered back down the hill. He remembered a night long ago when he had stood in a storm very much like this one, younger and certain, convinced that endurance was the same thing as strength. He remembered how wrong he had been. The lantern swayed slightly where it hung, as if stirred by an unseen hand. Eliza did not cry. She had learned that tears freeze faster than hope. Instead, she counted Jonah's breaths, matching her own to his, grounding herself in the simple fact that they were still here. The town had turned away, but the night had not ended yet. Winter, for all its cruelty, can be patient. On the ridge, Silas stood unmoving, his coat still on, the door unopened behind him. The lantern remained unlit, suspended between darkness and flame. Below, the shed crouched against the snow, holding two small figures the town had decided not to see. The wind carried the sound of the church bell fading into memory. That was how the night paused, balanced on a choice not yet made, the cold pressing in from all sides, waiting to see whether the light would stay on its hook or finally be lifted into the dark. Silas Crowell lifted the lantern from its hook with a care that surprised even him. The flame caught after the second strike, blooming into a steady glow that pushed back the dark without ceremony. He stepped out into the snow, the door closing softly behind him, as if the house itself understood this was not a moment for noise. The wind met him head-on, sharp and insistent, but he kept walking, the light swinging a slow arc that carved a path through the night. Eliza saw the glow before she saw the man. At first she thought it was the moon breaking through cloud, a trick of a tired mind. Then the light moved closer, purposeful, unafraid of the cold. Jonah straightened, his eyes wide, hope rising in him before caution could smother it. Eliza stood, every instinct warning her not to expect too much from a world that had already refused her. When Silas stopped a few paces away, the lantern between them, his face was lined not with judgment but with something quieter, harder to name. "You'll freeze here," he said. His voice was low, unpracticed in speeches. "There's room at the ranch." Eliza searched his face for the price of such an offer and found none spoken. Pride stirred, then yielded to reason. She nodded once. Jonah did not wait for permission. He stepped toward the warmth, drawn by the simple certainty of it. Silas turned without another word, trusting they would follow, and the trust itself felt like a gift. Inside the house, heat wrapped around them, startling in its immediacy. Eliza paused just over the threshold, the weight of the day pressing down all at once. Silas set the lantern on the table and fetched blankets from a chest that smelled faintly of cedar. He did not ask questions. He did not watch as Eliza helped Jonah out of his boots, steam rising from wool and skin. He busied himself with practical things, the kind that allow mercy to arrive without spectacle. Jonah sat close to the fire, his hands extended, a small smile tugging at his mouth as feeling returned to his fingers. Eliza noticed how Silas placed a mug within her reach without comment, how he turned away when her hands trembled too much to hide. These were gestures, not declarations, and they settled into her like something earned. The storm worsened outside, wind battering the walls with renewed insistence. Silas fed the fire, his movement steady, his presence a quiet assurance that the night would not take more than it already had. When Jonah's eyelids drooped, Silas showed them a narrow room down the hall, its bed simple but clean. Eliza thanked him, the words feeling inadequate, and he nodded as if gratitude were unnecessary. Sleep came in fragments. Eliza lay awake listening to the house breathe, to the storm slowly exhausting itself against solid walls. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to rest without planning for flight. In the other room, Silas sat at the table long after the fire burned low, staring at the lantern's dying glow, aware that something in his carefully contained life had shifted. Morning arrived pale and tentative. Snow lay thick and undisturbed, the world newly made. Jonah woke laughing, the sound unexpected and bright. Eliza moved through the kitchen, setting things in order without being asked, grateful for the familiar language of usefulness. Silas watched from the doorway, recognizing the quiet dignity in her movements, the strength that had survived without applause. The town learned of them before noon. Words traveled on boots and bridles, shaped by curiosity and old habit. Martha Kincaid arrived first, her mouth set, her eyes sharp. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Silas met her at the door, the space between them deliberate. "They won't be trouble," he said, though she had not yet accused. "And even if they were, they're staying." Martha looked past him, taking in the warmth, the child at the table, the woman standing straighter than she had the night before. Something flickered, then hardened. She left without blessing or curse. Others followed in quieter ways, their judgment softened by the simple fact of daylight. Snow has a way of humbling certainty. The days that followed were unremarkable in the way that matters most. Eliza helped where she could. Jonah explored the edges of the ranch, his laughter threading through the air. Silas spoke little, but he listened. Evenings found them sharing meals, silence comfortable, words unnecessary. When Eliza mended a tear in Silas's coat, he wore it the next day without comment, the stitch a small, visible truth. One night, as the fire burned low, the storm returned, less violent but no less insistent. Silas spoke then, not of the past in detail, but of loneliness, of a house that had forgotten how to be full. Eliza answered with her own truths, offered gently, like hands extended across a narrow table. They did not promise anything. They did not need to. By the time winter loosened its grip, the lantern still burned each night, lit out of habit rather than fear. Eliza and Jonah were no longer guests, nor were they claimed. They had simply been allowed to stay. And in that staying, something had taken root. I tell this story not because it is rare, but because it is easily missed. Dignity often arrives quietly, wrapped in ordinary kindness. If you have ever stood in the cold, wondering whether anyone would light a lantern for you, remember this. Sometimes shelter comes from a single, unspoken choice. And if this tale warmed you, if it felt like a hand on your shoulder in a long winter, stay with us and subscribe. For there are more Wild West stories like this, waiting to be told.